Now I want to start learning the cigar business. I'm a MacRae, said Annie. John MacRae hugged his daughter hard and said, "Thank you." The next morning, Annie and John MacRae went to the MacRae cigar factory. John MacRae held a meeting with all of the employees. He dispelled the rumors of the sale to a Chicago company and told them that Annie would be running the MacRae cigar factory. The cigar factory would remain in the MacRae family. John MacRae asked if there were any questions. There were no questions and no applause. 8½ months later, John and Molly stood by while Annie gave birth to a boy. The baby was healthy, but Annie had a difficult time. Much to their surprise, the baby had blonde curly hair. Annie refused to nurse him. The baby's curly blonde hair reminded John and Molly MacRae of Bonnie. Molly began to tear up. The boy was named Vincent by his grandparents. 2 weeks later, the grandparents took the baby to South Dakota. Annie immersed herself in running the MacRae cigar factory. She proved to be a very capable executive. Annie came out with a line of small cigars aimed at the newly liberated women of the 1920s. It was named the Cuban Belle. The MacRae cigar business thrived until the Great Depression of 1933. Annie had a premonition that the country would fall upon hard times. In one area of the cigar factory, she started manufacturing a line of women's clothing. At first, the line was primarily high fashion. Annie was surprised to find that her lower-cost, everyday line sold better and was much more profitable. One day, the wife of Milwaukee's police chief asked Annie to design a custom dress uniform as a gift for her husband. The police chief was delighted with the style and proudly showed it to his friends. As a result, Annie developed a line of custom uniforms, which eventually evolved into a line of uniforms for all ranks of officers. Annie taught the cigar workers how to cut material and use sewing machines. Cigar sales dwindled, but not one MacRae cigar factory worker lost his job. Annie moved the business to a larger facility to accommodate the sewing operation. John MacRae was proud of his daughter, but sad that she would not acknowledge her son. She told her father, under no circumstances, to ever bring young Vincent to Milwaukee. At Annie's request, when young Vincent reached the age of reason, he was told that his parents succumbed to a flu epidemic. He retained his blonde hair, but the curliness disappeared. Molly started calling him Vinny, and John MacRae started calling him Vinco. Young Vincent eventually became known as Vince. As Vince grew, he and John MacRae became inseparable. When Vince turned 12 years of age, John MacRae started to take him camping in the Black Hills. On their camping trips, they always rode horses into the Black Hills instead of taking John MacRae's Auburn Roadster. Vince learned how to fly fish and became proficient with his grandfather's single-action Army Colt and 1873 Winchester rifle. At the age of 13, Vince learned how to drive the Auburn Roadster. When John MacRae would travel to Milwaukee, Vince would beg his grandfather to take him along. John MacRae always found an excuse for Vince to stay home. Vince idolized his grandfather and wanted to follow in his footsteps. He worked at the Homestake Mine in Leeds, South Dakota during the summers. Vince attended the South Dakota School of Mines and graduated in June of 1941. By now, Vince is over 6 foot tall and muscular from his work in the mine. He bore a great resemblance to his grandfather. His blonde hair was cropped short, and he was popular with the few ladies his age in Deadwood. Vince started his career as an assistant lead person in one of the Homestake Mine's newer shafts. He progressed rapidly and was promoted to shaft supervisor. Although Vince is popular with the few ladies his age in Deadwood, with the long hours he puts in, he has little time for a social life. Vince lived with his grandparents in Deadwood, but sees very little of them. Whenever he asks about his parents, John MacRae quickly changes the subject. John, Molly, and Vince MacRae are listening to President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech. "Grandpa, are you ready to go back in? I see you still have your old uniform hanging up in the closet, up in the attic. I'm sure I'd have to salute you. They'll probably make you a general," said Vince jokingly. John MacRae was not amused and said, "That's not funny. I hope you don't do anything stupid, my boy. You're not thinking of enlisting, are you?" Annie had a worried look on her face and said nothing. Vince's voice took on a serious tone and he said, "Why? What would be wrong with fighting for my country? I'm not going to sit on my ass at home after what happened yesterday at Pearl Harbor. I hear the Japs might even try to invade our west coast." John MacRae shook his finger at Vince and said, "I forbid it. I already lost a son. I don't want to lose a grandson, too." Vince stood up and said in a quiet tone, "You don't have anything to say about it." In a somber tone, Annie said, "Vincent, listen to your grandfather." Vince turned and left the room. Annie started to sob. John MacRae sank down in his chair and shook his head from side to side and said, "God help us." 2 days later, Vincent MacRae enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. On December 15, 1941, Vince left for basic training at Camp Pendleton, San Diego, California. John and Molly MacRae resigned themselves to Vince's decision to enlist. John MacRae gave Vince the usual advice about keeping your mouth shut and never to volunteer for anything. They drove him to the train depot in the Auburn Roadster. It was a tearful goodbye for all three MacRaes. After 3 weeks of Marine Corps basic training, Private Vincent MacRae was told by his platoon sergeant to see the company commander at once. With a worried look, Vince said, "What does he want, Sarge? Am I in trouble?" The platoon sergeant said nothing. Vince entered Captain O'Hara's office. He snapped to attention and said, "Sir, Private MacRae reporting as ordered." Until now, Vince had never seen Captain O'Hara. He was surprised to see that Captain O'Hara was a heavy-set and portly man in his late 40s with gray hair. Captain O'Hara returned the salute and smiled and said, "Relax, MacRae, sit down. Would you like a cigarette?" Vince sat down and said, "I don't smoke, sir." Captain O'Hara said, "You will by the time this is over with, MacRae." The Corps is way short of officers. Hell, they even called up an old World War I vet like myself. He picked up a folder and said, "I've been getting good reports about you. Your platoon sergeant says you display leadership qualities. You have a good education. Have you ever considered going to Marine Corps OCS?" Vince said, "I thought about it, but I'd rather serve as an enlisted man." "Why?" said Captain O'Hara as he lit a cigarette. Vincent fidgeted, squeezing his utility cap, and said, "My grandfather was an officer during the Indian Wars. He told me a story about his patrols and some of the officers he served with. I'd rather serve as an enlisted man." Vince then told Captain MacRae the story of Sergeant Evans and the last bullet. Captain O'Hara frowned slightly and said, "Well, that's your choice, but let me know if you ever change your mind. There are some pretty good perks and privileges one gets as an officer. By the way, how did you get to be such a good shot? I'm told you are the best shot in Charlie Company." Vince smiled and said, "My grandfather taught me on his .73 Winchester, but that .03 Springfield is a much better rifle. It's got a longer range than the .73, and it's certainly more powerful." "Yes, they are a very fine rifle. I carried one in the Meuse Argonne offensive during World War I. Very reliable. It never let me down in those muddy trenches. If the rumors I hear are correct, you guys will soon be getting M1 Garands. said Captain O'Hara. After completing Marine Corps basic training, Vince was assigned to the newly activated 1st Marine Division. In August of 1942, Vince received his first taste of combat on the island of Guadalcanal. He was wounded at the Battle of Tarawa. By the time his unit was preparing for the invasion of Okinawa, Vince was a seasoned combat veteran. He was now a staff sergeant and a platoon leader with a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. Vince refused a battlefield commission. During his visits to Milwaukee, John MacRae would give Annie the latest news of her son's activity in the Pacific. When Annie was told of Vince being wounded at Tarawa, she went out of her way to appear disinterested and said nothing. John MacRae noticed that Annie was starting to age. She appeared older than 52 and did not look well. Annie was perturbed when John MacRae inquired about her health. On April 1st, 1945, the 1st Marine Division went ashore on the island of Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa was the bloodiest of the Pacific Campaign. The landings went unopposed because the Japanese refused to fight on the beaches. Instead, the enemy withdrew into caves in the Rocky Hills, forcing a long and drawn-out campaign. The American casualties were the largest of the Pacific War. More than 2,700 Marines died during the fighting. The battle lasted over 3 months. Sergeant Vincent MacRae remained unscathed until the last week. During a Japanese suicide attack, he was hit in the arm, leg, and chest with rifle wounds. The wounds were serious and life-threatening. Vince was evacuated to a hospital ship. Sergeant MacRae was operated on immediately and remained in a semi-coma for 5 days. When Vince finally came to, he tried to sit up. A young nurse quickly restrained him and gently lowered him back into the bed. Vince looked up at her and said, "Where the hell am I? Let go of me." Gina smiled and said, "Relax, Sergeant. You've been in a coma for 5 days. You were wounded on Okinawa, and now you're on a hospital ship. You've had a very serious operation, and you have to take it easy. You almost lost a leg, and we almost lost you." Vince frowned and said, "Who the hell are you?" Gina gave Vince a stern look and said, "I'm Lieutenant Rosano, and I'll be taking care of you. Now calm down or I'll have some restraints put on you." Vince's head started to clear, and he studied Gina's face. She was very beautiful with dark hair and flashing blue eyes. He also noticed the silver bar on her cap. Vince grinned and said, "You're pretty damn young to be a First Louis. I'd salute you, but my right arm's in this damn sling. If I gave you a left-handed salute, the Corps would probably bust me back down to a private." Gina was not amused and said, "Just behave yourself." Vince started to cough violently, and Gina gave him some water to drink. After the coughing subsided, Vince said softly, "Look, LT, I'm sorry for being such a jerk. Do you have any news on how it's going on Okinawa? I've been on several island battles, and Okinawa was the worst of the worst. I've seen a lot of good men die. The Japs fought to the death. We even lost our commanding general." Gina pointed to a newspaper on a table and said, "When you feel better, you can read all about it in the Stars and Stripes. The Japanese surrendered 2 days ago. For what it's worth, their general committed suicide rather than surrender. I'll be back later on to check on you. Is there anything you need right now?" "Yeah, can you get me a cigarette? I'm dying for a smoke," said Vince, as he pressed 2 fingers against his lips. Gina said, "No smoking for you. With that chest wound, a cigarette might kill you." When Gina returned, she noticed that Vince had been cleaned up, given a shave, and his blonde hair had been trimmed. Vince became very polite and lost the coarse demeanor he displayed when they first met. Gina sensed that Vince was an educated man, a handsome educated man. When Gina was back with the chief nurse, She asked to see Vince's records. The chief nurse said, "Why? Don't get involved with a patient, especially an enlisted man and a Marine. Those guys are crazy. I'm speaking from experience. I have been burnt and burnt badly." Gina ignored the chief nurse's warning and said, "Please, Captain." The chief nurse relented and pulled Vince's dossier. She handed it to Gina and said, "Here, but remember what I told you." Gina took Vince's dossier back to her quarters and read it. She was surprised to see that Vince refused to go to Marine OCS and twice turned down a battlefield commission. He received a Bronze Star at Tarawa and was to receive another commendation for his actions at Okinawa. Vincent was a graduate of the South Dakota School of Mines. Gina was intrigued by what she read. She returned the dossier and pondered the chief nurse's warning. The next morning, Vince was Gina's third stop. He was standing up with the aid of a pair of crutches and the help of an orderly. Gina smiled and said, "How's the patient today?" Vince said, "Okay, I guess. They tell me that I'll have a limp for the rest of my days. I suppose I should be lucky that I'm still able to walk." He took a few steps and started to fall. Gina and the orderly caught Vince and helped him back into the bed. Gina looked at the orderly and said, "Thank you for your help, Private. I'll take care of the sergeant. There's a corporal in number 12 whose dressing needs changing." "Any chance of a cigarette yet? Say, Lieutenant, is there any way I could get a list of the patients on this ship? I'm a platoon sergeant. I want to see if any of my men made it here. A lot of them got wounded in those suicide attacks." "No, you can't smoke anything with that chest wound, Sergeant." "I'm curious. Why did you refuse to go to OCS and turn down 2 battlefield commissions?" Vince was annoyed by the question. He snapped at Gina and said, "How the hell did you find that out? That's personal." Gina blushed slightly and said, "I noticed it on your dossier when we looked for an address to notify your folks. I was just curious." Vince did not know that Gina lied. She never was involved in any part of notifying a patient's family. Vince was sorry that he snapped at Gina and said, "Look, LT, I'm sorry I was rude to you. That's not an excuse, but I've been through a lot of shit. It's a long story why I chose to remain a non-com. I wouldn't want to bore you with it." Gina looked at the clean-shaven sergeant and said, "You wouldn't be boring me." Vince told Gina the stories of his grandfather, the stories about the Indian Wars and the Wounded Knee Massacre. He told her about the stories of the officers John MacRae served with. Vince talked about Sergeant Evans and said he wanted to serve as an enlisted man. Vince said, "There you have it, LT." Gina looked into Vince's eyes and said, "I think I understand, Vincent. Please call me Gina." Vince was startled but pleased with Gina's offer to call her by her first name. He chuckled and said, "You want to get me court-martialed, Gina?" Gina laughed and said, "I'll never tell." "Say, Vincent, I see you're from South Dakota. I've never been out west. I'm from Chicago." "Well, that's a small world. My great-grandfather has a cigar factory in Milwaukee. My aunt runs it. I hear Chicago is close to Milwaukee. I've never been to either place," said Vince. "I see your last name is MacRae. Are you Scottish?" "My parents are immigrants from Italy, but I was born in the States," said Gina. Vince grinned and said, "Actually, I'm Slovenian. My great-grandfather is from Yugoslavia. I don't remember for sure, but his name was something like Makranovic. He changed it to MacRae when he got to Milwaukee. They tell me he was an educated man and he spoke several languages. My aunt runs his cigar factory." "Oh, that's fascinating," said Gina. They talked for over an hour. Vince talked about his life in South Dakota. Gina talked about her life in Chicago. They studied each other keenly. The chief nurse poked her head in the doorway and said, "Rosanno, we need help in the operating room." Gina gave Vince a quick kiss on his cheek and said, "See you in the morning." She hurriedly left before Vince could respond. The chief nurse noticed Gina's kiss and in a stern voice said, "Remember what I told you, Rosanno." That night, both Vince and Gina had trouble falling asleep. The next morning, Vince was Gina's first patient. Vince was eating breakfast. He pointed to a plate of scrambled eggs and said, "This Navy chow sure beats the sea rations I've been eating for the past month." "You look sad. What's the matter, Gina?" Gina sat next to Vince and said, "I'm here to say goodbye. Vincent, this ship is filled and it's going back to the States. I'm being transferred to a mobile hospital in Okinawa." Vince sighed and said, "Oh, I was hoping we could get to know each other better." "So did I," said Gina. Vince handed Gina a sheet of stationery and said, "I'd like to write to you. Could you please give me your address?" As Gina finished writing her address, a sailor poked his head in the doorway and said, "Ma'am, the launch is getting ready to leave." Gina said, "I'll be right there." She handed the address to Vince. Vince looked into Gina's blue eyes and said, Gina put her finger on Vince's lips. She looked at Vince for a few seconds, then embraced him and kissed him hard on the lips. Vince's wounds caused him to wince. Before Vince could respond, Gina left hurriedly. As Gina boarded the launch, she began to tear up. Gina knew that she would never see the sergeant again. A sailor noticed Gina's tears and said, "Are you okay, ma'am?" Gina did not respond. During the voyage back to the States, Vince wrote a letter to Gina. He was confused and sad when he noticed that Gina had given him a Chicago address. Did this mean she no longer wanted to hear from him? He crumpled the letter up and threw it out of a porthole. Vince watched it disappear in the ocean waves. When the hospital ship arrived back in San Francisco, Vince was taken to Camp Pendleton to recover from his wounds. During the 2-month recovery period, Gina was constantly in his thoughts. He finally figured out what he had to do. After his recovery period, Vince was discharged from the Marine Corps. He boarded a train for South Dakota. When he arrived back at Rapid City, John and Molly MacRae were there to meet him. Vince stepped onto the platform with an aid of a cane. He slowly limped over to his grandparents. John and Molly MacRae's reunion with their returning grandson was much more emotional and tearful than his departure in December of 1941. Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945. In October of 1945, Lieutenant Gina Rosanno returned to the States. She went on a month-long furlough and returned to her parents' home in Chicago. Gina's mother said there was a registered letter waiting for her. It was from Deadwood, South Dakota. Gina knew who it was from. She recalled the chief nurse's warning and was tempted to throw the letter away, but she ended up putting it in a dresser drawer. 2 days later, she read the letter. "Dear Gina, I hope this letter finds you well. Even though we only knew each other for a few days, you have remained in my thoughts. I miss you and I want to see you again. I'm back at my old job with the Homestake Mine Company in Leeds, South Dakota. I live with my grandparents and told them all about you. They would love to meet you. Enclosed is a train ticket to Rapid City, South Dakota. Please send me a telegram and I'll meet you at the train depot. Vince." Gina told her parents about Vincent MacRae and let them read his letter. Gina's father laughed and said, "If I were you, I'd toss that ticket in the garbage. He's probably just a horny ex-Marine looking for some fun. From what I heard, there aren't too many beauties out there in South Dakota." Gina's mother frowned at her husband and said, "Oh, Vito, you just shush yourself. Gina, he sounds like a nice young man. His grandparents sound like good people, too." 3 days later, Gina boarded a train bound for Rapid City, South Dakota. Vince drove to the Rapid City train depot in his grandfather's Auburn Roadster. The auto was used very little by John MacRae and was in excellent condition. Gina's train arrived way ahead of schedule. She entered the depot and looked for Vince. He was nowhere to be seen. Gina's heart sank a bit. Just then, Gina noticed the Auburn Roadster pull up and park. Vince stepped out of the automobile and slowly limped into the train depot. Gina breathed a sigh of relief. She rushed over to Vince. He let his cane fall to the floor, and they embraced for a long time but did not kiss. Vince looked into Gina's blue eyes and said, "God, I missed you, LT." Gina kissed him hard on the lips. She smiled and said, "I missed you too, Sergeant." They drove back to Deadwood. On the drive back, most of their conversation was about the ending of World War II. Gina told Vince that she would be stationed at the Great Lakes Naval Station for the remainder of her enlistment, a total of 3 months. Gina said she was considering re-enlisting and making a career out of the Navy. Vincent ignored her comment and said, "How long will you be able to stay with us?" "I have to report back in 10 days, said Gina. At the MacRae residence, Vince introduced Gina to his grandparents. Molly gave Gina a firm hug and said, "It's so nice to meet you, my dear." John MacRae smiled and shook Gina's hand, then said, "Welcome to South Dakota, Gina. My wife will show you to the guest room, and after you get settled, we'll have dinner." The next morning during breakfast, John MacRae said, "I have to run into town. There's a wire waiting for me at the telegraph office. It's from Milwaukee. I'll be back before noon. Vince, why don't you take Gina for a ride through Spearfish Canyon after I get back?" Molly said, "I'll go with you, John. Our accountant said there are some papers for me to sign for the store." After his grandparents left, Gina went upstairs to freshen up and change. After she came down, Vince took Gina by the hand and led her into the parlor. They sat down together on a large brown leather couch. Vince held Gina's hand and said, "Do you believe in love at first sight?" Gina was startled by the question. She blushed slightly, and before she could answer, Vincent laughed and said, "Truth be told, I don't believe in love at first sight." Vincent's comment gave Gina a feeling of disappointment. "What is he trying to tell me?" thought Gina. Vince sensed disappointment in Gina's eyes. In a serious tone, he said, "I don't believe in love at first sight, but I surely believe in love at second sight. Gina, I've fallen in love with you." Gina's face lit up. She looked into Vince's eyes and said, "And I've fallen in love with you. Vincent, I was so worried that you wouldn't love me." Vince embraced Gina and said, "Well, your worries are over with. I love you, Gina. Oh, and please call me Vince. Everybody else does." Gina said, "I love you too, Vince." Then Gina kissed Vince passionately. A tear appeared in her eye. Vince talked about marriage with Gina. She expressed concern over her career in the Navy and her being able to move to South Dakota. Vince told Gina that she should take her time and he would figure out a way to make her happy, even if it meant his moving to Chicago. John MacRae stopped by the telegraph office and read the telegram from Milwaukee. It was from Annie. When he met Molly, John MacRae had a grim look on his face. Molly looked at him and said, "Johnny, what's wrong?" John MacRae handed the telegram to Molly and said, "Read this. Dear Father, I've been diagnosed with CJD, also known as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. They tell me I have less than 3 months. It's time I met my son. Please call me at the office. Annie."